Now, throughout this country's history, we've had conflict, we've had tumult, but we've never had a tyrant as a commander-in-chief. And that is not by coincidence. It's because the American people have always been willing to speak up and exercise their First Amendment right to protest, especially when our fundamental rights have been threatened.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. It is the basis for our existence as the country that we are. It's the basis for the country's founding, that there would be no king, no queen, no monarch, no dictator or autocrat ruling our country. It would be a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, people who have rights outlined in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is why when Donald Trump in 2020 reportedly wanted the U.S. military to shoot unarmed protesters in the legs, it was so stunning and scandalous and jaw-dropping, even for the Trump White House. These were Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, and the president at the time wanted his military to violently attack them by shooting them. That account of the president's thinking came from someone very close to him, his own defense secretary at the time, Mark Esper. Watch.
I thought that we're at a different spot now. He's going to finally give a direct order to deploy paratroopers into the streets of Washington, D.C., and I'm thinking with weapons and bayonets. And this would be horrible.
What specifically was he suggesting that the U.S. military should do to these protesters?
He says, can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something. And he's suggesting that that's what we should do, that we should bring in the troops and shoot the protesters.
The commander-in-chief was suggesting that the U.S. military shoot protesters.
Yes, in the streets of our nation's capital. That's right. Shocking.
So that really happened. But importantly, it's happening again. Donald Trump is in office again without Mark Esper or anyone like him who would constrain him from that. With armed military troops now deployed to the streets of Los Angeles, we cannot forget Mark Esper's words there. Take a look at this stunning moment on Capitol Hill earlier when Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin questioned the man who now holds Esper's post. Senator Alyssa Slotkin questioned the man who now holds Esper's job, Pete Hegseth.
Have you given the order to be able to shoot at unarmed protesters in any way? I'm just asking the question. Don't laugh. Like the whole country. And by the way, my colleagues across the aisle.
What is that based on? What evidence would you have that an order like that has ever been given?
It is based on Donald Trump giving that order to your predecessor, to a Republican Secretary of Defense, who I give a lot of credit to because he didn't accept the order. He had more guts and balls than you because he said, I'm not going to send in the uniformed military to do something that I know in my gut isn't right. He was asked to shoot at their legs. He wrote that in his book. That's not hearsay. So your poo-pooing of this, it just shows you don't understand who we are as a country, who we are. And all of my colleagues across the aisle, especially the ones that served, should want an apolitical military and not want citizens to be scared of their own military. I love the military. I served alongside my whole life, so I'm worried about you tainting it. Have you given the order? Have you given the order that they can use lethal force against honor? I want the answer to be no. Please tell me it's no. Have you given the order?
Senator, I'd be careful what you read in books and believing it, except for the Bible.
Oh, my God. So your former predecessor, I guess that's not enough for you.
That moment is where we start the hour with Senator from Michigan, Senator Alyssa Slotkin. Thank you so much for being here. I am a student of that paragraph of that book, of that chapter in American political history, of all the people who are in the room. And if you could just help me relive that moment. I mean, it is written about by Mark Esper. It's a standoff in the Oval Office with Stephen Miller. Mark Milley was in the Oval Office as well. And it is about invoking the Insurrection Act. It's about using the military in historic ways. Tell me what you think when you can't get the current Secretary of Defense to tell all of us and you that that'll never happen.
Yeah, I think the thing that you want him to give a simple answer, right? And in other questions, he gave a simple answer. But there just seems to be this impossibility for him of just saying, look, I'm going to protect and defend the Constitution. I'm never going to execute an illegal order. I love the military, and so I'm never going to let that happen, because he's so devoted to Donald Trump. He doesn't want to do anything that gets him in more trouble. And it just, you think about Secretary Esper when he was, in those important conversations with the president. Your character really matters. These things really matter. And what if he hadn't had that character? What if that Secretary of Defense had gone out and said, you know what, all these peaceful protesters, just shoot at them to get them to move. They're making the president look weak. We'd be in a very different moment right now. So I think it's deeply frustrating, especially for me as someone who served at the Pentagon, worked alongside the military. I don't want Americans to live in fear of their own military.
Well, and the military doesn't want that either. I mean, just explain the dynamic for the National Guard in any state, but right now we have them in LA. They are largely from the community. They're now patrolling. What is that like for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, the National Guardsmen are dentists and doctors and construction workers and people who either served before or want to serve in a part-time capacity when they're, and in addition to having a full-time job. So they very much are of the community. And I got a lot of staff and former staff that are Guardsmen, and they have almost no training on how to do things in a law enforcement context. That's the thing that we're sort of missing here. It's not just about uniformed folks showing up in a city. It's about what are they trained to do, especially a Marine, right? An active duty Marine. They are trained to go after the enemy in a ruthless way, and we like that. That's a positive thing when we're dealing with adversaries abroad. But it's a very different thing to bring that same Marine into an urban setting. They've had, as we heard the head of the Marine Corps say, 2 hours of training on law enforcement techniques. It's just a very different approach to the world, and you don't want mistakes. You don't want them getting jittery and shooting at someone by mistake and causing a bigger problem. So it's not just about the letter of the law. It's about the training that the military has or doesn't have in the kinds of things we're asking them to do.
A former senior military official told me that it's that piece, but it's also the self-selection. The people who go into the military for a reason, that if they wanted to patrol and protect, they would pursue law enforcement.
We made to avoid war because if there is a war, Joe, it's going to be a long war, and you want maximum legitimacy. You want the world behind this. That also creates leverage. And so how you get into this war, I think, really matters. I would say another thing, Joe, Donald Trump is now paying for the fact that he appointed a cabinet of knuckleheads. He's got a defense minister who is a former Sunday weekend host on Fox. His DNI, he's repudiated because she's another knucklehead. You hire clowns, you get a circus. And who is in the room there giving him advice right now? That is really scary. And this is why, when you hire people just for their slavish loyalty to you, not for their expertise and willingness to say no to you and to question you, that is really scary to me. And he's paying the price for that right now.
Falls and somehow the Iranian people put in place a democratic regime. But again, you can't name for me an example in the last 50 years where, military activity in the Middle East has ended well and predictably.
Congressman John Howman has the next question.
Hey, Congressman, we've been focused a lot on what's going on in Los Angeles over the course of this week. But back in Washington, the Secretary of Defense has been on Capitol Hill and kind of refusing, in a number of cases, refusing to answer questions that seem pretty straightforward and pretty legitimate, like talking about what the plans are and the budget's going to be for this retrofitting of the new Qatari Air Force One. Yesterday, he refused to answer a question from one of your colleagues, Ro Khanna, about whether he would abide by federal court rulings that were laid down. I'm curious about what you think of how you evaluate on the whole here, also his willingness immediately to dispatch those 700 Marines to L.A. I'm curious what you think of how Secretary Hegseth is doing at this point and whether we're starting to see some of the things that people worried about with his confirmation.
Well, of course we are, right? I mean, look, we could have a partisan bickering match about this, but serious people know that Pete Hegseth is way, way out of his depth, right? We saw this with the Signal chat. We saw it. We see it over and over and over again. And at the time of the Signal chat scandal, for example, when he was posting, in advance of strikes, precisely the weapon systems being used to undertake strikes against the Houthi, what I thought to myself, well, let's just hope that we don't have an international conflict that actually requires Pete Hegseth to provide advice, to provide wisdom, to provide judgment. And here we are with a war ongoing in the Middle East. So his behavior is perfectly predictable, right? If you work for Donald Trump, you are not a cabinet secretary, you are an acolyte. And you do exactly what Donald Trump wants you to do. And Donald Trump wants that Qatari jet. He wants the option to deploy the Marines throughout the United States. If you read that order that he issued, he can deploy military force, not just in Los Angeles. And it is not going to be Pete Hegseth who says, yeah, I'm not quite sure I agree with the president on that point. So not at all surprising that he couldn't even say, you didn't mention, but he couldn't even tell Mike Turner, my former chairman of the intelligence, he couldn't even tell Mike Turner that the Pentagon didn't have plans to attack Greenland because, of course, he can't.
Yeah, and certainly there have been a lot of questions raised about that, Greenland and Panama, from that hearing the other day. Ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut.
We've already heard for a long time rumors of Trump wanting Hegseth gone or considering having him go. Question marks in the title because we don't know if this is going to happen. But if it is, it's moments like this where Trump is humiliated by proxy. Because again, the nature of cabinets is that, well, a cabinet secretary does require Senate confirmation. They are basically chosen at the pleasure of the president and can be fired at the pleasure of the president. They don't need to have the Senate confirm a firing. To pick the new guy or gal after, yes. But this guy can be fired and selected, not appointed, but selected for appointment at the pleasure of the president, right? That's why most cabinet secretaries, are gone when a new president comes in, right? Because the new president's going to mostly want to bring in their own people because to serve at their pleasure and for their goals. But that means that when that person messes up or looks like a fool or looks like they don't know what they're talking about or gets embarrassed, well, that basically hits you, especially if you keep them on. And let's also be clear. Not only is this humiliating in a general sense, we know Donald doesn't like when women, people of color as well, but women speak up to him, stand up to him, humiliate him. He hates it. There's nothing more he hates than that. There are certain people that he feels he's better than. And that includes poor people, yes, because he's, a New York elite at his core, right? He can pretend to not be a big city elite, but that's what he is. But he also feels there are certain people with different skin color and a different, gender, different biological sex that are just beneath him. How dare she stand up to me? How dare she think she can challenge me? And when the senator from Michigan, right, when she stood up and said, you don't have the things below the belt, down there, and look, she could say she was talking to Hegseth, and she was, but she was also talking indirectly to a certain resident of the White House. That's going to absolutely piss Trump off. So, will Hegseth go? I don't know. Question marks for a reason. But this would be an impetus.